There is a saying among old soldiers. 1. They teach in the dark corners of academies that pretend to be about diplomacy and grace. It goes like this. Peace is just a war that hasn't remembered its own name yet. Nobody said this out loud at the Palace of Viorlone, of course. There the walls were painted with doves and starlight, and the tutors who came and went taught the young alien princess how to hold a spoon, how to bow to a foreign dignitary, how to keep her voice soft in a room full of louder people. That was the world Elira Voss walked into, on a gray morning, with a single suitcase and a letter of introduction that lied about almost everything in it. The letter said she was a linguist. It said she had taught the children of 2 minor noble houses on the outer colonies, that she was patient, thorough, and unremarkable. It did not say that she had spent 11 years in the Talon Corps, that she had buried 3 commanding officers and carried 2 of them out on her own back, or that the scar along her collarbone was from a blade meant for someone else's throat. Elira had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to disappear was to look exactly like what people expected to see: a tutor, a soft-spoken woman with ink-stained fingers and sensible shoes. Nobody looks twice at a woman like that. Nobody wonders what she's capable of. She had taken the position because the pay was good, and because the recruiter who found her, an old friend from a war that technically never happened, had said only one thing to convince her. The kid needs someone real. Elira had not asked what that meant. She assumed it meant the princess was difficult, spoiled, perhaps unteachable. She had pictured a small, sharp-tongued girl who threw tantrums over lesson plans. She had not pictured what actually walked into the receiving room that first morning. Small and blue-skinned and quiet in a way that made the hair on Elira's arms rise, because she recognized that particular quiet. She had worn it herself. Once it was the quiet of someone who had learned that being loud got people killed. The princess's name was Saffron Kai Doreth, heir to a throne that half the galaxy wanted gone. She was 11 years old by the reckoning of her people, which put her somewhere close to a human child of the same age, though she carried herself with a stillness no human child that age should have had to learn. She studied Elira for a long moment before she spoke, the way a soldier studies unfamiliar terrain. Then she said, "Are you actually going to teach me anything useful, or are you going to be like the last one and make me practice smiling at people I hate?" Elira had been trained to keep her expression neutral, under interrogation, under fire, under the particular pressure of watching friends die in her arms. She kept it neutral now too, though something in her chest moved, just slightly, like a door easing open after a long time shut. She asked the princess what she meant by useful. The princess did not hesitate. She said, 3 advisors have died in this palace in the last 2 years. Poison, a fall, and one who simply disappeared. My mother says I am to trust the guards and learn my letters and my posture, but the guards did not stop any of it. So I want you to teach me what to do when someone tries to kill me, because someone will. I've known that since I was 6. The room was very quiet after that. Somewhere outside, birds that were not really birds sang in a garden that was not really a garden, all of it dressed up to look peaceful for guests who never stayed long enough to notice the cracks. Elira looked at this small, solemn girl, blue-skinned and steady-eyed, asking the one question. Every etiquette tutor before her had apparently been too polite, too careful, or too useless to take seriously. And she felt something settle in her, low and certain, the way it used to settle right before a mission briefing, when the fear turned into function. She said, "All right, stand up, we start now." Nobody in the palace knew, not for months, what actually happened behind the doors of the North Study, where the princess's lessons were held. The court assumed etiquette, language drills, perhaps some history, some geography, the polite architecture of a princess's education. Nobody thought to ask why the princess started coming to state functions with new calluses on her palms, or why she developed a habit of positioning herself with her back never fully to a door. Elira had not lied. When she said she used to teach the children of noble houses, she simply left out what she taught them. In her previous postings, always temporary, always followed by a swift and unexplained departure, she had trained the sons and daughters of men who knew exactly what she was and paid extra for it. Bodyguards who taught etiquette. Soldiers who wore cardigans. An entire quiet industry of people like her existed in the space between wealth and war, and she had lived in that space long enough to know its rules by heart. The first lesson she gave Saffron had nothing to do with weapons. It was about breathing. She made the girl sit on the floor, spine straight, and simply breathe. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4, again and again until the princess's small hands stopped trembling with the frustration of being told this was the lesson. Saffron had asked, "When do we get to the part where I learn to fight?" Elira had told her the truth. She said, "The moment someone attacks you, your body is going to want to do one of 2 things. It's going to want to freeze, or it's going to want to scream. Both of those get you killed. The only thing that keeps you alive is the half-second where your mind stays clear enough to choose. That half-second is the whole fight. Everything else is just technique." The princess had looked at her for a long time after that. The way a smart child looks at an adult who has just told them something true instead of something comforting. Then she had nodded once and gone back to breathing. Over the following weeks, Elira built the lessons like she used to build defensive positions. Slow, deliberate, layer over layer. She taught Saffron how to read a room the way soldiers read terrain, noting exits, noting hands, noting the particular stillness of a person who was thinking about violence. She taught her which pieces of court finery could double as tools, how a hairpin could open a lock or find a soft place between ribs, how a formal sash could become a garrote or a tourniquet depending on the need. She taught her the anatomy of fear, the way panic narrowed vision and slowed reaction, and how to fight that narrowing with breath and repetition until the body remembered what the mind had trained it to do. She taught her, too, the things that had kept Elira herself alive on worse days than any 11-year-old should have had to imagine how to fall, so a fall didn't break anything. How to use an opponent's size against them, because Saffron was small and would likely always be smaller than most threats she faced, and size was a weapon only for people who let it be. How to disarm a blade grip, wrist to wrist, weight low, angle everything so the danger became leverage. How to recognize the difference between someone who wanted to scare her and someone who had already decided she was going to die. Because the second kind moved differently, and knowing the difference bought time. Did not spread because Elira made certain of it, keeping the training folded inside lessons that looked from the outside like posture drills and choreography for court dances. If a guard happened to glance through the study window and see the princess practicing a slow, deliberate step pattern with her tutor, they saw dance. They did not see footwork designed to close distance on an attacker's blind side. If the queen, distracted by treaties and trade disputes and the low hum of court politics that never quite stopped, asked how her daughter's lessons were progressing, Elira told her the princess was excelling in etiquette and languages, which was not exactly a lie because Saffron, sharp as a knife's edge in every other way, absorbed those lessons too, folding them in around the real work like camouflage. What the queen did not know, what nobody in that gilded palace knew, was that her daughter was becoming something the palace had never produced before, not a delicate flower to be protected behind glass, a blade being quietly, patiently forged. Elira found, somewhere in the 2nd month, that she had stopped thinking of this as a job. She had taken the posting, the way she took most things after the war, as a transaction, a way to keep herself fed and occupied and far from the memories that liked to catch up with her in quiet rooms. She had buried people. She had watched a command structure collapse around her in the final campaign of the border conflict, had carried out survivors on stretchers made of broken doors, had come home to a piece that never quite fit her anymore, like a uniform 2 sizes wrong. She had told herself that teaching etiquette to spoiled children of minor houses was penance, or maybe just numbness, a way to let the days pass without asking too much of her. Saffron asked something of her, not directly, not with words, but simply by being a child who understood, with a clarity that broke Elira's heart a little every time she saw it, that the adults around her could not or would not protect her, and that if she wanted to survive her own childhood, she was going to have to become someone capable of protecting herself. Elira recognized that particular loneliness. She had lived inside it. And somewhere in the quiet hours of teaching a girl half her size how to break a wrist grip, how to read the shift of weight before a strike, how to breathe through fear until it became simply information instead of paralysis, Elira found that she had started to care again. Not in the abstract way she cared about doing her job well. In the sharp, protective, entirely inconvenient way a person cares about someone they would, without hesitation, put their body between and a blade. She began staying later than the lessons required. She began walking the perimeter of the princess's wing at night, unofficially unpaid, simply because old habits did not die, and because something about this particular child made the old instincts roar back to life. She began, without meaning to, treating this posting the way she used to treat a command. Something to be defended, something worth dying for if it came to that. 6 months in, it very nearly did. The state banquet had been planned for over a year, a gathering meant to smooth relations between the Queen's court and a delegation from the Talon Corps, a coalition of outer systems whose loyalty to Varellan's throne had always been more performance than substance. There had been whispers, the kind that circulate in palace kitchens and guard rotations and never quite make it to official reports, that certain factions within the Accord resented the Queen's recent trade decisions enough to want her gone, and that a young, untested heir on the throne would be far easier to control or replace than a sitting monarch with decades of alliances behind her. Elira had heard those whispers too. She always did. Old soldiers develop an ear for the specific silence that precedes violence, and in the weeks leading up to the banquet, that silence had grown loud enough that she'd requested, quietly, to be present in the hall that night, ostensibly to help the princess navigate the evening ceremonial protocols. The Queen had agreed without much thought. Why would she not? Etiquette tutors attended banquets all the time, hovering at the edges, whispering corrections, making certain young royals didn't embarrass themselves with the wrong fork. Nobody, in that glittering hall, beneath the high arched ceiling strung with lights like captured stars, looked twice at the quiet woman in the modest gray dress standing near the princess's chair. That was, as always, the entire point. The banquet unfolded the way these things did, with long toasts and longer silences, delegates trading careful compliments that meant nothing and promises that meant less. Saffron sat straight-backed at the high table beside her mother, her small hands folded, her expression the careful, pleasant blankness Elira had spent months teaching her to wear like armor. To anyone watching, she looked like a well-mannered child enduring a long adult evening. Elira, standing a few feet back, watched the room the way she used to watch a valley before an ambush. She watched the hands. She watched the exits. She watched, in particular, a member of the Accord delegation's household staff, a young server who had been rotated into the banquet detail only that week, whose stillness did not match the stillness of a man simply doing his job. She could not act without cause. That was the frustrating mathematics of protection in a room full of dignitaries who would call armed intervention against an unarmed servant an act of war. So she did the only thing available to her. She caught Saffron's eye across the table for half a second and touched 2 fingers briefly to her own collarbone, a signal they had drilled a dozen times in the quiet of the North study. Threat. Close. Watch. Saffron did not flinch. She did not even blink. She simply, slowly shifted her weight in her chair, angling her body a few degrees, the way Elira had taught her, so that her dominant hand had a clear line to the small ceremonial blade. Every royal child of Varellan wore, sheathed at the hip during formal functions, a decorative thing, mostly symbolic, never meant to actually be drawn. Nobody had ever imagined a child would need it to be more than decorative. Elira had spent an entire month making sure that blade could be drawn in under a second, and that Saffron's hand would not shake when she did it. The server moved when the 3rd round of toasts began, in the exact moment the hall's attention turned toward the delegation's lead ambassador rising to speak. The exact moment every trained eye in the room would be looking anywhere but at the high table. It was a good plan. Elira recognized the craft in it, the way she recognized craft in anything, the cold appreciation of a professional watching another professional work. The man crossed the distance behind the high table fast and low, a thin blade already sliding free from his sleeve, his focus locked entirely on the small, blue-skinned girl seated at her mother's side. He had not accounted for the girl turning to meet him. Saffron came up out of her chair, not with a scream, not with the frozen panic of a child who had never imagined this moment, but with the exact economy of motion Elira had drilled into her for 6 months, evening after evening, until it lived in her body deeper than fear could reach. She did not try to run. Running was what everyone expected a child to do, and running would have gotten her a blade in the back. Instead, she stepped into him, closing the distance he'd been counting on to give him room to strike, her small hand catching his wrist in the exact grip Elira had shown her 100 times, weight dropping low, hip turning, using his own momentum to fold his arm back against a joint that was never meant to bend that direction. The blade clattered against the marble floor. The man screamed, a short, startled sound, more shock than pain, though the pain would certainly come a half-second later when his brain caught up with what his wrist had just been told to do. Saffron did not let go. She drove her weight down and back, exactly the way she'd practiced against Elira 100 times in the North study, and put him on his knees, his own arm bent behind him at an angle that made further struggle a very bad idea. The hall had gone silent, in the particular way a room goes silent when violence arrives. Somewhere it was never supposed to exist. Chairs scraped, someone's glass shattered on the floor. Guards who had been standing at the edges of the room, trained for a threat that never came from inside their own formation fast enough, finally surged forward, weapons drawn, shouting orders that were already several seconds too late to matter. Saffron stood over the kneeling assassin, her small chest rising and falling, with the deliberate, measured breathing Elira had taught her on the very first day. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, her grip on his wrist, steady even as the rest of the hall dissolved into chaos around her. She did not look afraid. She looked, Elira thought, watching from a few feet away with her heart slamming so hard against her ribs. It was a wonder. The whole room couldn't hear it, like a girl who had simply done exactly what she had been trained to do and had trusted that training completely. The guards reached her a moment later, wrenching the would-be assassin fully to the ground, pinning him, disarming whatever else he carried. The queen was on her feet, her formal composure utterly abandoned, crossing the space to her daughter with a speed no ceremony had ever asked of her, gathering the girl into her arms with the kind of desperate, trembling relief that comes only after the mind has fully processed how close a disaster had come to happening. Saffron let herself be held for exactly as long as it took to confirm the threat was neutralized. Then, still in her mother's arms, she looked past her, across the wreckage of overturned chairs and spilled wine, and found Elira standing exactly where she always stood, a few feet back, quiet, watchful, unremarkable to anyone who did not know better. The princess did not smile. She was not, even at 11, a person who smiled easily. But something passed across her face, something steady and certain, an acknowledgement that needed no words. She had been taught, she had listened. And when the moment came, exactly the moment she had told Elira on the very first day, that, she knew, would eventually come. She had not frozen. She had not screamed. She had done the thing she had been made ready to do. The investigation that followed lasted the better part of a week. It surfaced exactly what the whispers had suggested, a faction within the Accord delegation that had grown impatient with the Queen's trade policies and had decided a traumatized, controllable child on the throne would serve their interests better than a living, inconvenient monarch. The would-be assassin, once his wrist had been properly set and his tongue properly loosened, gave up names, connections, a whole thread of conspiracy that palace security had somehow failed to notice for months, despite whispers that had clearly reached at least one etiquette tutor with sharper instincts than her job title suggested. It was during that investigation that the Queen finally asked Elira the question she had on some level been expecting for months. They sat in the Queen's private study, the one with the star charts on the walls, instead of doves, a room reserved for conversations that mattered more than the palace's public face admitted to. The Queen looked, for the first time since Elira had arrived, genuinely uncertain, the careful authority of her office momentarily set aside in favor of something rawer. She asked how her daughter, an 11-year-old girl who had never held a weapon in her life, as far as the queen knew, had disarmed a trained killer in under 4 seconds without hesitating, without freezing, without so much as raising her voice. Wylyre considered lying. It would have been easy. She had built an entire career on being underestimated, on letting people believe exactly what was convenient for them to believe. But she looked at this queen, whose fear for her daughter was etched plainly into every line of her face, and she decided that the woman deserved the truth, even if the truth implicated Elira in 6 months of quiet insubordination against the explicit, unspoken expectations of her post. She said, "Your daughter asked me, on the first day I met her, to teach her something useful instead of etiquette. She told me 3 advisors had died in 2 years, and that nobody had ever taught her what to do if someone came for her next. I made a judgment call. I taught her how to survive." The queen was quiet for a long moment. Elira had been trained to read silences, and this one carried grief in it and something like shame. The particular shame of a parent realizing that their child had understood a danger the parent had spent years trying to shield her from, and that the shielding itself had left her defenseless. The queen asked who exactly Elira was, because no etiquette tutor she had ever heard of taught disarming techniques between grammar lessons. Elira told her, all of it, the 11 years in the Talon Corps, the border campaign, the command she'd lost, 1 soldier at a time, over a war that the history books would later describe with breathtaking dishonesty as a minor territorial dispute, the years afterwards spent drifting between quiet postings, teaching the children of people who understood, even if they never said so directly, exactly what they were hiring when they hired her. The queen listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Elira finished, she asked only one more question. She asked why Elira had never told her. Elira said, "Because you would have said no." Everyone always says no until the day they desperately wish someone had said yes sooner. There was a silence after that, long and heavy, and then the queen did something Elira had not expected to do. She laughed a short, exhausted, disbelieving sound. The laugh of a woman who has spent months worrying about the wrong dangers while her daughter quietly prepared for the right ones. She said that she supposed she owed Elira rather more than a tutor's salary. Elira told her that she didn't want more money. She said, "If you want to thank me, keep me on. Not as a tutor, as what I actually am." The queen studied her for a long moment, the way rulers do when weighing a decision that will outlast the room they're sitting in. Then she nodded, once the way Saffron so often nodded, and Elira realized with a small, private ache exactly where the girl had learned that particular gesture of quiet, decisive acceptance. In the months that followed, the palace of Virulon changed in ways the wider galaxy never quite noticed, because change of this kind does not announce itself with fanfare. It simply becomes the new shape of things. Elira's title changed from tutor to something the court records listed, blandly, as senior instructor of royal comportment. A title that satisfied the diplomats and told the truth to absolutely nobody who mattered. Her actual work expanded. She trained a small cadre of guards in techniques the old palace security detail had never considered. Techniques built not around brute strength, but around reading intention, closing distance, turning a threat's own momentum against itself. She restructured the princess's protective detail from the ground up, rooting out 2 more compromised staff members in the process, men who had been quietly feeding information to interests outside the palace for years, without anyone noticing, because nobody had ever thought to look at the household staff with a soldier's eye instead of a courtier's trust. And she kept teaching Saffron, though the lessons grew more advanced, more nuanced, moving beyond the raw survival mechanics of the first 6 months into something closer to strategy, into the kind of thinking that turns a person who can survive an attack into a person who can prevent one from happening at all. She taught her to read alliances the way she'd once taught her to read a room full of strangers. She taught her that the sharpest weapon a ruler ever carries is not a blade at all, but the ability to see danger coming long before it arrives at the door. Saffron absorbed all of it the way she absorbed everything, with a quiet, relentless focus that unsettled some of the older courtiers and utterly delighted the ones who had grown tired of watching royal children coast through their education on charm alone. She was, at 12 now, still small, still soft-voiced in public, still capable of the practiced pleasant blankness that had once fooled an assassin into thinking she was simply a child who would freeze. She was also, unmistakably, no longer only a princess waiting to inherit a throne. She was becoming someone the throne would be lucky to have. There was an evening, almost a year after Elira's arrival, when the two of them sat together in the North study, long after the lesson had technically ended, the way they sometimes did now, not as tutor and student, but as something closer to what soldiers call it when they've bled for the same cause. "Saffron," asked Elira, without any particular drama in her voice, why she had said yes that first day. Why an actual soldier, someone who could have taken any posting, any post-war position that didn't involve babysitting a nervous child, had chosen to stay and teach her how to survive instead of simply reporting the danger and letting palace security handle it. Elira thought about the honest answer for a moment, the way she thought about most honest answers, weighing whether the truth would help or simply burden. She said, "Because you were the first person in a very long time who asked me for something real. Everyone else wanted me to pretend. You wanted me to teach." Saffron considered that with the particular gravity she brought to everything, and then she said that she thought Elira had needed to be needed for something real again just as much as she had needed protecting. Elira did not answer that directly. She simply reached over and adjusted the angle of the girl's wrist. A small, habitual correction, the kind a teacher makes without thinking, the kind a parent makes without thinking, and said only that her form was improving. It was the closest either of them ever came to saying it out loud. The story of what happened at the banquet did not stay contained to the palace for long. Court gossip has never respected boundaries, and within a season, the tale of the young princess who disarmed her own assassin with her bare hands had traveled through the diplomatic circuits of a dozen systems, growing taller and stranger with every retelling, until some versions had her fighting off 3 men, or wielding a blade the size of her own body, or facing down the entire Accord delegation, single-handed. The truth, as it usually does, remained more interesting than the myth, though nobody outside the palace ever fully understood the truth, because nobody outside the palace ever learned the name of the quiet, gray-dressed tutor who had spent 6 months teaching a frightened child exactly how to stop being frightened. Elira preferred it that way. She had spent a war being seen, being counted, being reduced to a rank and a unit number on casualty reports. She had learned, in the long unraveling afterward, that there was a particular peace in being the unseen hand behind something good, in mattering without needing anyone to know that she mattered. The princess knew. The queen knew. That was enough. What changed, fundamentally, permanently, in the palace of Verellen was not simply the presence of a hidden protector, or the training of a single remarkable child. It was the quiet, structural shift in what the court believed royalty was supposed to be. For generations, princesses of Verellen had been raised, the way princesses everywhere are raised, ornamental, protected, kept soft and pretty, and useless in matters of real danger, because real danger was supposed to be someone else's job. Saffron Kydorth broke that pattern the moment she asked her first tutor for something useful instead of something pretty, and Elira Voss broke it further by being exactly the kind of person willing to give a child what she actually needed instead of what tradition demanded she receive. Other houses noticed. Eventually, the way houses always notice when something works. Within a few years, it became something almost fashionable among the nobility of Verellen's allied systems, quietly seeking out tutors with backgrounds like Elira's. Retired soldiers hiding in academic clothing, women and men who had once commanded units or held the line in wars nobody talked about anymore. Willing to teach children of privilege the same hard lessons Elira had taught a frightened, clear-eyed girl in a study full of star charts and old grief. It never became an official policy. It never needed to. It simply became, quietly, the new shape of how the powerful chose to protect the people they loved. Saffron ascended the throne years later when the reckoning of time finally asked it of her, and she did so not as an ornament with a crown, but as a ruler who had, since the age of 11, understood precisely what it meant to survive, to protect, and to see danger clearly enough to stop it before it ever reached a blade's distance from anyone she loved. Elira stood at the edge of that coronation the same way she had stood at the edge of the banquet hall years before, quiet, unremarkable to anyone who did not know better, watching the girl she had once taught to breathe through fear, take her place at the head of a nation that would for generations afterward tell the story of the assassination that failed and never quite understand how close it had come to succeeding, or how much of its failure belonged to a woman who was only ever supposed to teach manners. There is a particular kind of victory that never makes it into the official record. It does not get a monument. It does not get a statue in the palace gardens between the false doves and the false stars. It lives instead in the quiet, unglamorous accumulation of 1,000 small lessons, 1,000 evenings of practice breathing and patient repetition, 1,000 moments where a frightened child chose again and again to trust the person willing to tell her the truth instead of the comforting lie. Elira Voss never got a medal for what she did in that palace. She never wanted one. Lord! She had already learned, long before she ever set foot in Verilon, that the truest measure of a soldier's worth was never the ribbons pinned to a uniform, but the people who were still breathing because of what she had taught them, and the quiet, hard-won knowledge that somewhere, in a study full of star charts, a girl who had once been afraid had learned, instead, how to be ready. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, if you felt something in that moment, when a small girl stood over her own attacker and simply breathed in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, let me know in the comments below. I want to hear which part hit you hardest. And if you want more stories like this one, tales of quiet protectors, hidden strength, and the unexpected people who turn out to be exactly who the vulnerable needed all along, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss the next one. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars, and remember that the people who look the most unremarkable are sometimes the ones worth trusting most.